Okay. Well, thank you, Avneet, for this invitation, and also thank you for the good briefing and update you gave, both to the people and to myself. Yeah, my name is Hussein Askari. I'm originally from Iraq. I was born in Iraq in 1968, and I had to endure actually both a civil war in northern Iraq and the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 88, and then the Gulf War, the so-called Kuwait War. And after that, I left Iraq with my parents and brothers and sisters, ended up in Norway first in 92, and then I moved to Sweden after I had joined this organization, or the Schiller Institute. And now the reason I joined this organization, I was living in Oslo around the time of the Oslo peace process between the Palestinians and Israelis. And there's, besides that, the Schiller Institute had the best idea on how peace could work, because there will be no peace without economic development, where people can have an idea that peace will give them a better future, rather than settling old religious and political issues which go back thousands of years. So people have to think into the future. And that was the reason I became fascinated with the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement. But also I joined the movement because it taught me history is subjective. History is not something which just passes in front of our eyes or beneath our feet. But history is something we can also affect. So now I've been working with the Executive Intelligence Review for many, many years now, almost 20 years. It is 20 years now. And I'm here, I live in Sweden, because in Norway we didn't have a political organization, so I moved to Sweden, which is closest to Norway. I got married here, of course, but then I became the party leader for the Swedish European Labour Party, and we participate in political campaigns and elections, in addition to our function as members of the international movement. And for myself, I have to take care of all our Arabic website and also cover the Southwest Asia region. But you know, there's something interesting. What I always have to think about is that what always Lyndon LaRouche says, you know, is that if any self-respecting political leader or statesman have to live or has to live in the future and act on the future, not as an ivory tower kind of dream, but as actually a scientific and moral challenge for all of us and for that person. And I would like to show you something from my PowerPoint presentation to give you an example of what that future is.
Which one do you want to show?
All right, after the title, there's the map of the world land bridge.
Go ahead.
All right, so this is what I mean by you have to have an image of the future, and this has been the image of the future for me and for our movement generally. But the thing is, you know, this is not simply a physical thing, because what I learned from working with Lyndon LaRouche and also translating his book, So You Wish to Learn All About the Economics, what fascinated me is that the idea of you can forecast the future of the economy, for example, is not by measuring simply how much food you produce, or how much cars you produce, or how much energy you produce, or how much unemployment you have, or where is it going. All these things are useful data, but what you really have to understand and measure is the culture of that society you are looking at, and what is the image, what is the view of the human being in that culture is. And that has been one of the most fascinating things for me to learn about economics, is that it has to do with culture and the human factor, which is the factor of human creativity. So the thing is, if we besides this idea of the future, I'll come back to the whole idea of the Silk Road and the Eurasian land bridge. But I have to just go back to what Avneet was saying in the discussion on the Obama impeachment process. I wrote, and the Iraqi situation, when this whole Iraqi new phase of the Iraqi crisis emerged with the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, took over one of the largest cities in northern Iraq, northwestern Iraq, Mosul, and then advanced towards the capital. I wrote an article which was available. I think Avneet refers to it in her invitation. But I wrote actually about not simply the events themselves, which is useful to know, but what was the intention behind these events, and the intention behind what is going on in Iraq and dividing Iraq and demolishing Iraq as a sovereign, modern sovereign nation state was actually is a British policy, which was first pronounced by Tony Blair as Prime Minister. He had newly become Prime Minister of Britain, and he gave a speech in Chicago in 1999 before a meeting of some of the world's most important leaders, including President Clinton. But in that speech, he pronounced certain ideas about the shapes of things to come, how to shape a new world of globalization. But then he focused on one very important issue, which is the idea of the sovereignty of nations. Because we cannot have empire, you cannot have globalization without getting rid of the idea of the sovereign nation state. In 2004, you have to know that Tony Blair and the British government were the main architects of the Iraq invasion 2003. That's where the things started in Iraq, even though there were wars before that. But what this situation now emerged out of the Iraq invasion 2003. But in 2004, I mean, Tony Blair and the British government were the architects of the Iraq invasion, and Tony Blair personally was responsible for providing the so-called intelligence on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, the yellow cake story, and the 45 minutes that the Iraqi army or government could bomb any target in the world within 45 weapons of mass destruction. These came from the British intelligence and Tony Blair government directly, and the Bush administration used it internally to the Bush administration used it to convince the Congress and people in the United States that it was legitimate to go to war in Iraq. But Tony Blair personally was responsible for that war, and Tony Blair now, like Obama, is actually facing both impeachment and a threat to that he could be tried for crimes against humanity for launching the war of aggression in Iraq. Now, Tony Blair in 2004, he wrote an article defending his position on going to war in Iraq and invading Iraq and lying about Iraq so-called weapons. I mean, Tony Blair said later that the issue was not the weapons of mass destruction. The issue was we wanted to get rid of the Saddam Hussein regime. But in this article, he said, in defense of himself, he wrote, I'm quoting from it, he said, "So for me, before September 11th, I was already reaching for a different philosophy in international relations from a traditional one that has held sway since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. This is important. Namely, that the country's internal affairs are for it, and you don't interfere unless it threatens you or breaches a treaty or triggers an obligation of alliance. I did not consider Iraq fitted into this philosophy, though I could see the horrible injustice done to its people by Saddam." This is not, so anyway, you know, Tony Blair, in that 2004, he refers to his speech in Chicago, which is, I mean, in that speech in Chicago, he did not refer to the Peace of Westphalia by name. He just referred to the principle itself, and he advocated that it's legitimate to use military force to overthrow other sovereign governments if we, you know, consider it important to achieve what, you know, human rights and so on and so forth. But remember, it was almost exclusively the LaRouche movement who were engaged in fight. Well, there were many people who opposed the Iraqi war, but or the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But Lyndon LaRouche personally, Helga Sepp LaRouche, and our movement were exclusively the ones who were out defending the principle of the Peace of Westphalia by name, and also in reference to the Southwest Asia region. That was the peace treaty of Westphalia was one of the most important achievements in Europe after the religious wars. And the British Empire and Tony Blair wanted to roll back that important development, which had become part of the, after World War II, became part of the United Nations Charter and so on and so forth. So that was, you know, and even in the preparation period for the war against Iraq, the LaRouche personally and our movement were directly involved in fighting the Blair and the Bush-Cheney administrations by exposing their lies and working with people who actually sharing our idea that this is not simply just a war to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, that this was a turning point in history which will lead to a global confrontation and world war. You remember that Lyndon LaRouche was also on the BBC just before the invasion of Iraq. Most of the people who interviewed LaRouche on the BBC were fired later. And then you had the same people had interviewed Dr. David Kelly, who showed how Blair lied or sexed up the intelligence on Iraq. Dr. David Kelly was found dead a short period after that, which is clearly a murder, but it was covered up. So I learned from my work with the Executive Intelligence Review and the LaRouche rumors that the best way to learn to know your enemies is to engage them in a fight. That's the best way to learn about your enemies. Now, the LaRouche movement, including myself, have been involved in fighting against the British Empire and its agents in the United States, in Europe, even in Southwest Asia, in Asia, and so on and so forth. And we have learned a lot through that process. Now, when I joined this movement, I didn't know so much actually about the history of Southwest Asia, so I had to do a lot of homework. And the people in the Executive Intelligence Review were very helpful. I mean, there are people I worked with in Germany, in Wiesbaden, who provided me with a list of books and materials I had to read. And on my own, I had to read a lot of these things. I'm going to give you a short list of sources you can rely on. Besides the publications we have had issued in the EIR, there are others who have done quite good work, which gives you a background on this. But the whole situation now is the LaRouche doctrine going to succeed in saving civilization, or is it the Blair doctrine which will succeed in destroying civilization? And I think this is not a completely done deal. We have an enormous potential to succeed, but also that the world has changed dramatically. Now there are new powers on the stage with the development of the idea of the Silk Road, or the Eurasian Land Bridge, or the World Land Bridge, which was the idea of the LaRouche movement. But now there are powers in the world who have adopted that policy at their the policy of the economic integration of Eurasia as their future strategy. China specifically have declared that a long time ago, but they are working intensively on that. Russia, India, and a long list of nations of their neighbors in Asia and Eastern Europe who have joined that new constellation of economic, political, and hopefully cultural power in the world. And we are fighting here in Europe, and you are fighting in America, that we join that because this could be the new renaissance for human culture in the world, and the end of all empires and the end of wars, as Helga Sepp LaRouche declared in the New York conference recently, the conference of the Schiller Institute, which is, I hope everybody can watch it. But this whole Silk Road idea, and I'm going to use material I did put together for the a presentation, a similar presentation I did in Copenhagen a couple of months ago. But the same idea is still valid, and I've been looking more into this question, is that is the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road and the modern Silk Road, are these Is it simply physical things? Is it about trade? Is it about? And I discovered that besides, the physical infrastructure is a vehicle for transfer of culture and creating a new renaissance and having a dialogue among civilizations as needed. And by looking at the ancient Silk Road, I found the same thing. Now, if we go back to the slideshow. When people talk about the ancient Silk Road, what you get is this image. If you go after the World Land Bridge picture, you go to the third one, is the ancient Silk Road. This is the image you get. Is that that there's a caravan of camels which goes from point A in the east to point B in the west. And the problem is that this is not completely true, but it's the same problem with people dealing with the idea of the Eurasian land bridge outside our organization. They think the idea of the Eurasian land bridge is to move some goods from point A to point B. But then they forget the idea is that between point A and B, a whole new civilization can develop. Now, the image I would like to use for the ancient Silk Road is this one, the next one, which is not very clear. I picked it up from an old Arabic book, and it shows the trade routes in Asia, Africa, and Europe between the 8th and 11th century. And what you see there is not simply a camel caravan moving from point A to point B, but you can see that a whole series of centers, cultural centers, developing in Central Asia, in Iran, in Iraq, and all the way into North Africa, to Sub-Sahara, to Timbuktu, for example. People have heard about Timbuktu now in Mali, that this was a great cultural center. So what you had as a result of the economic development and trade relations of these, you had also the idea of a culture developing. Cultural development became the key issue in economic development because you need scientific and technological advancement to improve the process of production, the health situation of the people, and other conditions of both of the biosphere and the human society. And therefore this became not simply from Baghdad, that the Silk Road became a vehicle for culture and a dialogue of cultures and the transfer of science, technology, and new discoveries from Asia through the Islamic world in Southwest Asia, North Africa, into Europe and Spain. I'll get into that. But I would like to just refer to this idea of the future as an idea or an intention that in 750 Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca, which was a small trade city and also a religious center, but it was run by a financial oligarchy which resembles very much the Venetian financial oligarchy, which had enslaved people in the whole region through debt. But also they had control over the religious center in Mecca, where you have the different different gods of the different tribes centered inside what is today the Kaaba. So they controlled both the economy and the culture of the people and the religion of the people. Now the Prophet Muhammad at the age of 40 declared himself prophet. But at that point, also when he established his small city-state in Al-Madinah, he sent messages to the emperor of Persia, the emperor of Byzantium or Eastern Rome, and to the emperor in Egypt of the Copts. And he told them, he's a simple man, not simple, but from a small city. He said, give up and turn to Islam because we are going to take over, and because Islam is the right way to go. So I imagine, these emperors getting this message from the Prophet Muhammad, that they were laughing at the message. But the reality was that Persia and Rome have been at the end of their existence, because they had gone through a process of degeneration and wars between Persia and Rome. So in the time of Prophet Muhammad came in the 7th century, these two empires were collapsing, but the problem is that the risk was that the whole civilization would collapse as a result of the collapse of these two empires. The Prophet Muhammad offered them a recipe for survival through following the Islam, but not only Islam is a continuation of the Judeo-Christian traditions, but they refused. So it took about 30, 40 years for the Islamic State to expand and defeat both the Persian and the Roman empires and take over that region. And then you had a completely new civilization developing. But in that process, what Prophet Muhammad ordered his followers to do is that they have to seek knowledge. There's a prophetic saying, is that you have to seek knowledge even if it was in China, because knowledge is very, very precious, more precious than other things. So if there's knowledge in China, you go and fetch it. And at the time, actually, China, if you go to the next slide, was also an important empire. The Tang dynasty had expanded its sphere of power all the way into Central Asia. The Prophet Muhammad had actually sent people to China to open diplomatic relations, and he sent a man, his name is Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who actually led the actual battle later to defeat the Persian Empire in the middle of the 8th century. But this Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he went to meet the emperor of the Tang dynasty in Xi'an, in southern China, and he explained for him the teachings of Islam. And the Tang emperor, who was a Confucian, he said, well, this is not so much different from our idea of God and man, and it's completely coherent with our idea, so you are welcome here. And so diplomatic relations were established with the Chinese empire. And this is actually, if you go to the next slide, there's a mosque in Guangzhou, which was the capital of Xi'an, the capital of the Tang Empire. There's a mosque in the name of Abi Waqqas, the messenger or the diplomat the Prophet Muhammad sent. If you go through to the next, this is the image of the Huasheng Mosque, which exists today. Actually, this is one of the oldest mosques in the world, besides what we have in Mecca and Medina. And it has been preserved by these Chinese. There is actually a Chinese Muslim community, if you go through the next 2-3 slides. But sometime in about 750 AD, when the Islamic State expanded eastward and the Abbasid dynasty had taken over before the establishment of Baghdad as a capital, there was a clash with the Chinese army in Central Asia. What is today actually is Uzbekistan. There was a battle called Larouche. There was a battle in 750. It's called the Battle of Talash. But that battle actually ended up with a treaty signed between the Muslim state and the Chinese Tang dynasty, which ended in very good diplomatic relations and the demarcation of the borders of the Islamic State and the Chinese state. So there will be no further clashes. But interestingly, in that battle, the Muslims, among the prisoners the Muslim had taken, there were two people who were experts in the production of paper. You know, the Chinese were the first ones who used what we have today as paper. It was invented in China around 105 AD at the Han Dynasty period. That instead of in the normal, what was known at the ancient times is the papyrus. The Egyptians produced papyrus from slices of reeds. But what the Chinese had developed is that you can make some sort of the pulp paper from wood, using the fiber from wood and mixing it with other material to produce very thin films or sheets, which can then be used for writing documents and so on. The thing is, this is very, very interesting theme to discuss how the paper came about. But the use of paper was limited to government documents and other important documents in China. But what happened is that when Baghdad was established in 767 by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who was a friend of the Chinese emperor. Actually, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, he had sent 20,000 Muslim fighters to support the Chinese emperor, Tang emperor, to fight against a rebellion inside China, some sort of a civil war. The Lushan rebellion had taken place in China, and the Chinese emperor was besieged in his capital, and he asked the Muslim leader Abu Ja'far al-Mansur to support. And according even to Chinese history and Muslim history, that the Abu Ja'far al-Mansur had sent both weapons and a large contingent of Muslim soldiers to support the Tang dynasty, and the rebellion was pushed back. Now, many of those Muslims, they stayed in Guangzhou, in China, and established a small Muslim community, and that community has continued up to now. Now, there's a Muslim community in China, in South Central China, not the Xinjiang in the West, which is the problematic, but there's another ethnic Chinese Muslim group. It's called the Hui Muslims, which was established in that region since that time. And if you remember, there was an attack on the Chinese train station in January this year, if I remember correct, in Guangdong, in China, in a train station where terrorists attacked people with knives and killed around 29 people. Now, that city is one of the major centers of the Chinese Hui Muslim community, who have been part of the Chinese community and actually have been part of the Chinese state in certain times. If you go to the next slide, there was a Chinese officer, an admiral, who was a childhood friend of the emperor of China, and he was an admiral, and he led a voyage to the Arab Sea and to the Red Sea, and some people even say that he visited Mecca and Medina. This general Zheng, he was a Muslim, originally, and he is considered a legend in China. And there is a museum. If you go to the next slide, there's a museum established for him and his voyage ship. If you go to the next image, this is called the treasure ship, because it was supposed to go to the west and bring back treasures. Obviously, these treasures are not simply gold and diamonds, but this was to get some knowledge, some intelligence about what is going on in that region. This was a bit later in time. But what we had in Baghdad, if you go to the next image, I use this image, that Baghdad was established in 767 by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the same Abu Ja'far al-Mansur I mentioned, who was a friend of the Tang dynasty emperor. And Baghdad became a center not only for the political center for the Islamic State, it also became one of the most important cultural centers of that time. Now, what happened in Baghdad is that the Baghdad Caliphate, Abu Ja'far Mansur and his son Harun al-Rashid and grandson Al-Ma'mun, they established what is called the House of Wisdom, which was a center for translating. Not only the idea was to bring every possible work of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, geometry, as you know, all possible sciences and philosophy, bring them from all corners of the world and translate them and verify if these they fit with the teachings of Islam or the philosophy of Islam, and use that to proliferate that knowledge within the Islamic State and build the state on the basis of these scientific discoveries or rediscoveries, and develop a completely new scientific and cultural strata in society in Baghdad, but also in other cities. And that became one of the biggest missions, cultural scientific missions in history. So books, manuscripts, and translators and scientists were brought from all parts of the, from India, from China, from the Roman, you know, what was the Roman Empire still in today's Turkey, Byzantium, and these manuscripts, which then the dominant part of it was the Greek works of the Greek scientists and philosophers like Plato, of course, and Aristotle too, but also all works of geometry and astronomy and medicine were brought and translated. And the immense rewards were given to the people who did the translation. I wrote an article on the Baghdad and the Islamic Renaissance in Baghdad in EIR recently. You can go back to that. But one thing is the reference I made to the two Chinese prisoners who were experts in production of paper. They were brought because to do all that translation and to proliferate all that products, you could not use either papyrus or leather or anything. So these two Chinese prisoners were brought to Baghdad, and they taught other people how to produce paper. And Baghdad, and later Damascus and Cairo, became one of the largest centers for production of paper in the world. And books then, which contain all this human heritage of science, were printed in Baghdad, not printed by machines. This came later when the Muslims brought paper to Spain and Andalus, and then the Europeans used that later, and then the technology for the printing machine was developed. But in Baghdad, they became one of the largest. So books become one of the largest commodities produced in the Islamic State. And therefore, I would like to refer, and I'm working more on this, the question of papers, that instead of calling it the Silk Road, we should call it the Paper Road, because that was the best way that cultures and science from different cultures were united and then reproduced and proliferated all around the world, as I said, into North Africa, into Spain, and then into Europe, where the Greek heritage was once again brought back to Europe through the Muslims. So you had book stores, you had libraries all over Iraq, all over the region. I mean, in Basra, there was a market for books, and that market still exists today. In Baghdad also, that market still exists, where people bought and sold books. But the idea is that the whole Silk Road idea was a cultural renaissance idea. The Silk Road became, the physical Silk Road became a vehicle for transfer of culture, science, technology, and a dialogue among different cultures. Now I had this image from Al-Mas'udi. He was an astronomer actually, and a geographer. He collected all the geographical works, and he redrew the map of the world, which looked quite accurate, except for the fact that America is not represented, but this was the world as known in the 10th century. And this was the the greatness of the Islamic Renaissance, but also the role of the Silk Road, is that you established a culture which was based on scientific excellence, on scientific discovery, technological advancements, and without discrimination of what the source of that knowledge or science was. Even it was people who are so-called non-believers. They were human beings, exactly like the Muslims themselves. And these were very, very much appreciated. And I actually, in Baghdad, you had the people working in the House of Wisdom. Many of them were Christians. There were many Jews. They were all working together as one team. And Iraq was like a melting pot. There were, churches and synagogues in Baghdad. I refer in my article to that in, extremely unbelievable numbers of Jews and Christians who lived in Baghdad. Unfortunately, today there are almost no Jews in Baghdad, and the Christians have been leaving Baghdad and Iraq in thousands, thanks to Tony Blair and George Bush's war and invasion, and the invitation of the Al-Qaeda to come and start business in Iraq, as they did in Syria. Now, most Christians, had to leave their homes and their towns in Syria, thanks to Obama's war in Syria, support of the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic terrorists there, through the Saudis, through the Qataris, and so on and so forth. But I just go back to the theme of the Silk Road. Actually, in the 11th century already, the Islamic State was split into many different parts, and religious fanaticism started to take root into the Islamic culture. But also they had the idea of empire developing again, and there were many, many different factions. I will not have time to go through it here. I mean, we have written about that in both Fidelio earlier, but also in EIR. But if you go to the next slide, you had, because of the split in the Islamic State itself, Spain became a different entity, or Andalusia. Northern Africa became different. So what is today Southwest Asia was controlled by different conflicting groups. But then Venice had emerged as an empire in the Mediterranean, a financial, a trade, and political empire, which then had to destroy all its potential rivals in the Mediterranean, both Christian and Muslims, actually. And then they came with the idea of the Crusades to so-called liberate Jerusalem from the crazy Muslims. And European oligarchs, kings, princes, and armies were used in that war, which continued for almost 200 years, or more than 200 years. And it destroyed as much of the Southwest Asia as it did in destroying Europe. And that led to, there's a very good article which was wrote by our colleague Paul Gallagher on how Venice almost destroyed civilization in the collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses in Italy. That's a very good, but that initiated the whole Dark Age period, where almost half of the European population was, died in the plague. But also the plague had engulfed Southwest Asia, and through the Mongol invasion, which looked more like the ISIS, these new Islamic terrorist types. It's always exactly a copy of that, because these were not forces who were there to control anything. They were there to destroy culture and civilization and kill as many people as possible. And this is what I refer to the Al-Qaeda and these Islamic terrorists today as the Neo-Mongols. Of course, the Mongol nation now today, we have to respect them, but I'm referring to this old Mongol invasion, which simply destroyed culture and civilization in Southwest Asia almost completely. And we went through a dark age for several hundred years in Southwest Asia. But in Europe, you had the European Renaissance in the 14th and 15th century, which then developed through the work and ideas of Cusanos into the whole idea of what could become later the sovereign nation state, and then you had the voyage to America, Christopher Columbus' discovery of America, and what followed after that. That you had the first anti-imperial force winning, actually, since the Dark Age, winning against the British Empire, and managing to establish the first sovereign republic, simply in modern times in the world. So now we, went from this whole the Silk Road did not exist anymore. Between China and Europe, there was almost a void. There was very little civilization existing. All these major cities I showed you earlier in Central Asia, Iraq, Iran, almost disappeared. The population had collapsed. I mean, Iraq went back to the population density which existed in the 9th century in Iraq, only in the middle of the 20th century, sorry. Iraq regained its population density which existed 1,000 years ago. So the population in that region and culture had declined and collapsed all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, when the British then came. But we still had people who were fighting for a sovereign, some sort of a modern culture and independent states, which the British used then to create this, what we call the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but also the whole idea of dividing and conquering. They divided this region into conflicting ethnic, religious groups or ideological groups, and control both sides the whole time. I mean, we have been writing about that. I can go through that shortly soon. But then if you go to the next image, we have, after all these years, we had the idea of the new Silk Road re-emerging as a vehicle for civilization, building civilization. And that idea is what emerged out of the LaRouche movement work. And Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, if you go to the next slide, she took personal responsibility to making this idea a reality. And through her work and the other associates' work with people in Russia, China, in India, and all over the world, we made this idea not only a known fact, but a reality. And this, of course, this emerged from, if you go to the next image, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, an idea for a Marshall Plan for Eastern Europe, or the circle, what Helga Tsepp-LaRouche and the LaRouche movement called the productive triangle, that now was the time to use the technological potential and industrial potential which still existed in Western Europe to develop Eastern Europe and beyond. And then in the early 1990s, if you go to the next image, the whole idea of the new Silk Road and the integration of the Eurasian landmass became a more clear vision. I personally, if you go to the next image, this special report, the Eurasian landbridge, this was the first comprehensive, and it is still one of the most comprehensive works in the world on this whole idea, how it could be achieved and how it, and what changes it can create in the world. And I personally took part in composing that report. I was working on the Southwest Asia part of the whole Eurasian and African land bridge with other people in the Executive Intelligence Review. So I finally became able to make my dream by joining this organization a reality. Is that history is subjective, and we can actually, instead of being victims of history, we can become makers of history. And it's a great empowerment for every one of us who work every day to make these, both to create ideas but also to proliferate ideas, like the great Renaissance people before us. If you go to the next image, this was the beginning of the whole idea of the Eurasian land bridge taking shape. And then Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, if you go to the next image, personally and the associates and Lyndon LaRouche then traveled all around the world. They organized hundreds of conferences, seminars, studies to make this idea become. And in 1996, the Chinese government officially adopted the new Silk Road as its policy. And recently, the new president of China, Jinping, he once again renewed that commitment to the Eurasian land bridge and the new Silk Road in many events he personally took part in and organized by China. So Helga Tsepp-LaRouche was a pioneer of the idea, and this idea, to go to the next image, became recognized in other nations, in India, and the next image is in Russia. This became also a major issue. Now Russia is working actively on the Eurasian concept, and of course there are different people in Russia who have different ideas about the Eurasian land bridge, but our idea is the original one. And there are people in Russia who respect that fact, like Mr. Sergei Glaziev, which you can see in this image. This was a meeting. He invited the LaRouches to the Russian Duma for a seminar. And Mr. Sergei Glaziev, who's in the center of the image, is now the advisor, or one of the advisors of the president of the Russian Federation. So that idea is not simply an ivory tower dream, as I said, but this was a scientific and moral challenge and political challenge, and many fights were taken to be able to make that idea today become a reality. And there is no other choice for the world and for civilization than working to realize the world land bridge and Eurasian land bridge, and in cooperation with the major powers, including the United States, when it's cleaned up from the agents of the British Empire. Mr. LaRouche also, if you go to the next image, which will take us into this other part of my presentation on the role of the British in the region. I mean, in 2002, now 9/11 had taken place, but Lyndon LaRouche pointed out that 9/11 was some sort of a military coup, which was arranged by the British and their people in the United States, and it was covered up. The purpose of that coup was to turn the United States into a military dictatorship and work together with the British to realize what Tony Blair had said in his speech in 1999, the end of the Westphalia Treaty principle. But Lyndon LaRouche, by making that very courageous move, I mean, Lyndon LaRouche already warned that something was in the working already when Bush became president. In January 2001, LaRouche warned, and we actually, through the year, made that warning known all over the world that something is about to happen in the United States. A major terrorist attack or something, which will give George Bush and his administration exclusive massive powers over the people of the United States, over the military and so on, to launch this British global empire idea. And Mr. LaRouche became very well known in the Arab world. I personally was, and other members of the Executive Intelligence Review, writing weekly columns in many Arabic newspapers, both warning against that policy, but also presenting what Lyndon LaRouche was proposing as an alternative policy for the United States. And if you remember, Mr. LaRouche was presidential candidate both in 2000 and 2004. So he was acting as a presidential candidate and a leader of the United States. And that gained Mr. LaRouche enormous popularity in Southwest Asia, to the extent that the United Arab Emirates wanted him to come to address a very, very important conference arranged by the Zayed Center in Abu Dhabi on the future of oil politics, or oil in world politics, and what is going to be the future of oil in world politics. And in that conference, I mean, I have a picture of the front row of the people listening to LaRouche. Now, in this picture, you have to the right of Mr. LaRouche is the oil minister of the United Arab Emirates. But in the front row, all the ministers of the government of the United Arab Emirates were sitting there listening. and there were Arab oil ministers, finance ministry people in the audience. So this was a very, very VIP kind of conference, and it was a shock for a lot of people. The Zayed Center got threats, as I was told later by the gentleman to the left of LaRouche, Mr. Mohammed Khalif Al-Murar, when I visited the center, and we started a collaboration with the center and the Schiller Institute. And he told me that personally, he said, we got threats from the American embassy, the Canadian embassy, the British embassy, the Australian embassy, and the New Zealand embassy, all English-speaking countries still run by the British Queen. And they told us we should disinvite this crazy man, Lyndon LaRouche. He's a crazy and dangerous person. And because the seminar was announced in all the major Arabic newspapers, internationally and in the region. So this was a known fact, so people knew this was going to take place. And the embassies of those countries in the United Arab Emirates, they threatened the Zayed Center if they allowed LaRouche to speak, but they didn't listen. There was a conflict in the United Arab Emirates on the US policy, the British policy, and they included people in the family of the Sheikh Zayed. Unfortunately, the Zayed Center was later shut down. This conference I'm referring to took place in May, June 2002. Now, Blair and Bush administration were preparing at that time the invasion of Iraq and cooking up the intelligence, sexing up the intelligence and preparing everyone in the region to prepare themselves for an invasion because the decision was taken. And in our collaboration with the Zayed Center, we made enormous efforts, and they actually helped arrange many conferences in Abu Dhabi to bring people, experts, scientists, politicians from all over the world, people we knew, to counter the war effort. The Zayed Center was shut down when the invasion of Iraq took place. So the people who were in charge of the Zayed Center, they were kicked out, they were fired from their government positions, because they were told now it's the Anglo-American policy, which is. But in that conference, Lyndon LaRouche told the people there that their focus of the Arab countries and on the idea of being exporters of raw oil and gas to the rest of the world and living off the revenues of the oil and gas, this should be scrapped. These nations have to use two factors, that they are, they both have that wealth, so-called national wealth, but that they are also strategically positioned between two major continents or three major continents, that they should use their position between Europe, Asia, and Africa to become a hub for not only transport between all these continents, but also to build industries using the cheap transport possibilities to transport both goods and technologies to this region and from this region. And that the oil and gas should be used not as energy exported to the rest of the world, but used as raw material, a feedstock for petrochemical industries, which would mean that the barrel of oil would multiply in value if you turn it into other products like plastics, chemicals, and other things which are used for a much, much higher value. And also in that conference, Lyndon LaRouche warned again against the coming collapse of the financial system and the coming war in that region, but that this will then develop into a global war. Now, the British had their plans, and the Bush, Cheney, they also had their plans. As I said, they went on with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and they want to use Southwest Asia, as always, as both controlling it, but as using it as a stage for destabilization in the world. And now there was this factor, not simply that you can use Islamic terrorism against others, against other powers, as was done in the Afghan war, when they used Islamic terrorists or mujahideen, so-called, that the British, American intelligence, with the help of the Saudis and others, and the Pakistani intelligence, they used these mujahideen to defeat the Soviet army in Afghanistan. And now these same mujahideen were spread all over the world. They're attacking China, they're attacking India, they're attacking Pakistan itself, they're attacking the Muslim nations, Iran, Iraq now, Syria, all over the place, that they became assets for the Anglo-American policy or the British Empire policy. But there's also this other aspect that this region sits on the world's largest reserve of oil and gas. And if you go to the next image, and the British also, they want to use that fact so they can use Islamic terrorists to attack their rivals, Russia, China, India, and other nations who don't follow the British policy. They also want to use the fact of the oil and gas to control their rivals. Now, this image of the Eurasian, the world land bridge, but with a special focus on Southwest Asia, where there is this arrow, is Bandar Abbas, which I visited twice to attend conferences, and it's located, if you look at this second image, on the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the narrowest choke points of transport of oil and energy in the whole world. This is one of the most dangerous places, although there is no fighting there, but this is potentially one of the most dangerous places on Earth for the world economy, simply because the world has turned away, and other nations in the world have turned away, but hopefully they are coming back, from high technology and nuclear power development into relying on oil and gas. So all this nonsense about solar energy and wind energy and renewable energy, this is nonsense, because most industrial nations in the world, they rely on coal, oil, and gas for their energy supplies. So through this Strait of Hormuz, every day, tankers pass by there carrying 17 million barrels of oil, which is almost 40% of all oil consumed around the world. Passing through this narrow strait, which is where the arrows are, is like 1-2 kilometers wide. If you look at the next image, this is I took myself last February when I was in Bandar Abbas. This is from the island of Hormuz, which the Hormuz Strait was. You can see, when it's not foggy, you can see the United Arab Emirates on the other side. But you see all the ships which pass by still. Go to the next image. This is me on top of the little mountain there. And this is at the Portuguese castle, an old Portuguese castle, because this region was still important for all the imperial forces on the way to India and China to control all these posts and place military equipment and personnel to protect their trade routes between Asia and Europe, which became a maritime kind of transport route when the Silk Road did not exist anymore. But if you go back to the Strait of Hormuz image, now this is what the British have been controlling. The British control these Arab Emirates, you know, the Sheikdoms, Oman. These are still British colonies, and they got their independence, so-called independence, in 1971, where Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates became so-called independent. But the British never left, because they still had military treaties, but also they controlled the economies of this region. I mean, in Dubai, you have 100,000 Britons living there. And you have like 2,000 British companies, and the British controlled some of the largest financial and real estate companies in Dubai, the hotels and the financial firms. You can look at some of these largest real estate companies and financial holding companies in Dubai. Just look at the board of directors of these, and you'll find British, Irish, sometimes Canadian, Australians, very few Americans there, because Americans don't dare to work in that region. They are hiding in their military bases. But the British go all around the place in nice suits as financial and economic advisors. The next image is, I mean, I just mentioned how much of the world oil reserves. But what the issue is, if you go to image number 29, which is this the net imports of top 3 net fossil fuel importing countries. You can find the United States, Japan, and China. These are the largest importers of oil and gas and coal. But unlike the United States, China and Japan and India and South Korea and many nations in Asia, they are completely reliant on the Middle East or Southwest Asia for their oil imports. The next image shows you Japan total energy.
Right, so just backtrack to the British controlling Dubai.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, as I mentioned, is, you know, unlike the Americans, they go with their big boots and weapons and they hide in their military bases. But the British go around in nice suits to run the economy and, of course, intelligence. I mean, Tony Blair himself is advisor. The Blair Associates is a public relations corporation established by Blair, is advisor to almost all the governments in the region. So imagine having Tony Blair as advisor, what kind of policy he would have. But anyway, the thing is, what the British control is, if you go to this, to the next, to top 10 net oil importers. All right, so you see the United States is the top importer of oil. But unlike China, which is number 2, Japan, which is number 3, and India, which is number 4, South Korea, and many other nations in Asia. What is different between the United States and these nations is that these nations are almost completely reliant on oil coming from the Gulf region through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's a major, major strategic threat to those nations. And the British are using that as a blackmail against Asia. Now, if you go to the next image, it's a briefing paper. Now, this briefing paper was issued or published in April 2013 by the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, which is one of the oldest military intelligence think tanks, whose major subscribers are to their briefings is the Queen herself, the Prime Minister of Britain and his office, and all members of British Parliament and other important institutions. They read the briefings from this institute because they are the real, beside other oligarchical institutions, these are some of the real authors of British policy. The British government is not the one who decides British policy. The British government runs the British people, you know, to keep the British people under control, you know, fed to a certain extent and kept quiet. That's the function of the British government. Besides implementing, using the British government institutions like the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Department, intelligence, and so on, to implement the policy of these oligarchical imperial institutions around the world. So Tony Blair implements that policy, and he uses his government institution to protect and implement the policy. I don't know if you remember, there was this scandal, the Al Yamama arms deal scandal between the British and Saudi Arabia. Now, it was signed in 1985 by Margaret Thatcher with the mediation of none other than Prince Bandar bin Sultan, one of the main sponsors of international terrorism and one of the main operators in the attack on the United States in 9/11. Prince Bandar mediated that arms deal with the British. It's now called the British Aerospace Systems, which is the world's largest manufacturer of arms. Actually, it's larger than the American ones. It has bought up many European and American arms producers, the BAE. Now, the BAE, the thing is that the deal went through the British were bribing the Saudi princes and the people in the royal family to get the deal through. And then they had a separate fund of oil, which the British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell could use. But then there was a slush fund was created out of that money to finance military coups in Africa, financing Islamic terrorist group all around the world. Prince Bandar himself has mentioned that in a book, actually a published book, that he was proud of that, using that money. But also part of that money, which was deposited in Prince Bandar's account in the Riksbank in Washington, was used to finance the housing and logistics of some of the kidnappers or the hijackers in 9/11, which is now a major issue in the United States. The so-called 28 pages, which are declassified, they show how Prince Bandar, obviously, and the Saudis were financing that. But this was done with the help of the British. Now, at the last 2 years of Blair's government period, this Al Yamama arms deal thing became a major issue in internal British politics and international politics. Blair decided single-handedly to shut down the whole investigation. No investigation will be carried out, and the BAE would merely pay fines to the government or to the justice system in Britain and get away with their crime. You know, the same thing they did with these drugs banks in the United States laundering Mexican drug mafia money. They just get fined. But Blair protected the BAE using his government office. But he is protecting a policy of the British financial oligarchy, and it's controlled by the royal family. But now this RUSI, this Royal United Services Institute, it's interesting to look at what they say and what they discuss, because some of these policies are not secret, because they have to prepare both people in government and in the public to accept the policy which is coming. So therefore they have to create a public discussion of what they intend to do, but they have to camouflage it in a different wording. I'm going to read to you just very quickly the foreword of this report by the chairman or the Secretary General of the Royal United Services Institute. It's available on internet. You can print it and read it yourself. But I'm just reading some very interesting in this. It will save me time going through a lot of the history of the British control. He says, at a time of economic retrenchment and growing uncertainty within Europe, it may seem strange that the UK sees its future military security increasingly east of Suez. Such an emotive phrase suggests imperial ambitions at a time when UK armed forces are smaller than they have been for 200 years. But there are compelling reasons for the UK to take its Gulf relationships much more seriously. Now then they go through how they're going to do that. But then they say, and shows you what I said, the British government have not decided that this is their policy, but it's the policy of this institution. So this may not yet be declared government policy. Indeed, the government may prefer not to plunge into a public debate about it. But the UK appears to be approaching a decision point where a significant strategic reorientation of its defense and security towards the Gulf is both plausible and logical. Now, what are these logical and plausible reasons for having a new policy that the British Empire should go back, even with military means, to the east of Suez? Now, east of Suez is Southwest Asia, but they're not talking about Syria, Iraq, because these places will be burned down by the Islamic. What they want to protect is the Gulf Sheikdoms. Now they say, and they declare this policy, say, I quote, there is significantly more at stake in this renewed relationship than mere military posturing. By enhancing the UK's relationships with the states of the Southern Gulf, the UK is committing to the security and longevity of the Arab Gulf states. Sheikdoms which display only limited elements of democratization as understood in the West, and which have taken seemingly contradictory positions towards the Arab upheavals that spread across the Middle East since 2011, opposing the Shia revolt in Bahrain, but supporting the Islamist revolution in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Syria. The UK will also find itself very much on the fault lines of searing sectarianism between the Sunni and Shia worlds of Islam. That is increasingly defining the geopolitical landscapes of Gulf and Middle Eastern security. Within Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and to a lesser extent Kuwait, all contending with the significant sectarian challenges to their internal security, and with Iran and Saudi Arabia engaged in what is so far a sectarian Cold War in which the temperature could quite easily rise. And listen to this, the unintended consequences and outcomes of the UK's strategic embrace of Arab Gulf states should not be underestimated. Now this is what, to read between the lines, it says, most of the North Africa and Southwest Asia is going to hell. There is so-called, what they call economic retrenchment in Europe. There's an enormous economic crisis in Europe. So what do the British do? Well, they say we have to go back and control that region. Why? And then they, by the way, they say we will find ourselves on the fault lines of sectarian war, which means that the Britain have to take a position for one party against the other, which is Saudi Arabia and the so-called Sunni part against the Shia. And then they say there could be so-called unintended consequences and outcomes of this UK strategic. Unintended, but they know that this will come. The natural outcome of their intervention in the region, that there will be these religious wars, and Britain will take part in these religious wars by protecting the sheikdoms and the kingdoms of the Gulf. And therefore we need special forces, they say, and more intelligence and security work in the Gulf, rather than sending major, the Americans are stupid enough, they have their aircraft carriers. But what we need to send is special forces and intelligence, small forces, to intervene in very sensitive. But, and this is where this whole idea of the transport of oil to Asia and Asia's reliance on the Gulf region for its energy needs. It says, the report, and I quote, lastly, this move is not just about securing loyal and wealthy allies in the Gulf. Mind you that most of the Gulf so-called wealth funds, they invest their money in British financial, banking, and real estate institutions, and to a certain extent in Wall Street. But a lot of that money goes already to Britain. So they say this is not our only purpose. Lastly, this move is not just about securing loyal and wealthy allies in the Gulf. It is also a different iteration of the transatlantic special relationship. They say we are making the United States a favor. How? Much has been written about the Obama administration's Asia pivot, the refocusing of U.S. efforts away from the Middle East and towards the Far East and Pacific Rim. The likelihood of the U.S. being drawn away from the Gulf to a significant degree as a result of this intended rebalancing remains a point of contention. Whether the U.S. wishes to or even can reduce its forced commitment to a region that has had such prominence in its affairs over several decades should be questioned. Indeed, there is a line of thought that the Obama pivot may see the Gulf region become even more important to U.S. strategic planners, with one prominent commentator noting that, this is another quote, for geopolitical reasons, including China's increasing reliance upon Gulf energy exports, the American pivot towards Asia, and indeed sub-Sahara Africa for that matter, cannot be completed without control of the Persian Gulf. And while the US is happy to put the 9/11 wars behind it and wind down its expensive and traumatic military campaigns in Iraq, which ended in December 2011, and Afghanistan, it cannot delink from the Persian Gulf. So here it is. It's not simply that we like the money from the Gulf sheikhs. There is another global strategic issue here. We have to help the United States war on China. And how we do that? Well, China is increasingly becoming reliant on oil coming from this region. And therefore, controlling that region can help in the war against China. This is how the British oligarchy thinks. And I would like you all to read the whole report, but read between the lines. But in that sense, what they do is they keep the United States tied to the British Empire policy by saying, we are making you a favor because you have your rival China, you know, and we're going to help you in your war against your rival China. So they want to draw the United States even deeper into a conflict, a meaningless conflict with China, rather than the United States allying itself with China and going with the Silk Road policy by alienating the United States, you know, making the United States alienating itself from the potential allies, China, Russia, and so on. They want the United States to get into a conflict with China over so-called limited natural resources. This is a very good example of how the British you know, run this policy, but at the same time they put it in a completely different light. And while people are busy looking for the American culprits, they forget to watch the British, because the British can sneak behind you while you are looking for an American, and then they can stab you in the back. And that has been their policy since after World War II. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt tried to pull the carpet under Churchill and the British, but unfortunately, with his death, his policies were not implemented. And the British continued their control of these policies of these countries by controlling the governments and the leading royal families there. And those who did not like the British Empire were crushed with wars or civil wars or military coups. But what is worse is that Britain is keeping the United States military and economic force at its own disposal by drawing the United States into these wars, into these conflicts, and saying that we have a special relationship, we have to work together. But the best thing to do now to solve this situation is to abolish the special relationship between the United States and Britain, get rid of the imperialist faction in the United States, which is the Obama personally, but also the neoconservatives and the liberal imperialists in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And that's why you can free the United States to act in a coalition with Russia, China, India, the four powers, which LaRouche used to call, to have a completely new world order and get rid of empire. That would be the only situation or solution for the global strategic crisis, which has given us the crisis in Southwest Asia. The problem is that people look at Southwest Asia and say, what is wrong with the Iraqis? What is wrong with the Syrians? What's going on in Iran? Before asking what's wrong in the world that made Iraq such a mess. And therefore we have to, in looking at daily events and news and so on, we have to look at who shapes the policy, who are the big players, and what is their philosophy and ideology, as I referenced to Blair or Prince Philip and whoever. They shape the ideas that make the policies. This is what they have to look at. But we have to have a knowledge of the region of the history of the region, of the geography of the region, so we can both understand it but also present a solution to what seemingly are local problems. Now, I don't think I have so much time now to go through the LaRouche movement's idea for peace through economic development in Southwest Asia, and Helga herself have presented this in different conferences, the fight against the desert and desertification, and greening the desert, bringing economic development. But all that will depend on solving the global strategic crisis which we have now, which we can see also have emerged in Ukraine, that the Obama administration has chosen to go to the path of world war with Russia. So this is, I had, as I said in the beginning, we cannot look at history or events as objective things. We have to make them subjective, personal issues. I take these things very, very personally, not because I'm Iraqi. I mean, I live here in Sweden. My children are born in Sweden. I'm active in Sweden to defend the Swedish nation, but because I'm a world citizen, and because I believe that my existence and the work I can do together with the LaRouche movement can have a lasting effect on giving people and coming generations a future. Our knowledge and my knowledge is limited, but I have to fight every day to learn new things. I have to discuss with people who do know certain things about, agriculture, physics, nuclear power, and so on and so forth, as much as we can. But we have to have the overall idea, what is the fight is, not only today, but throughout history, what LaRouche has defined as the Promethean vis-a-vis the Zeusian system. As I said in the beginning, any political leader, political activist, or statesman worth the name have to live in the future and have to act on the future as Prometheus did. And I think I would close with that and open for the questions.